I'm going to talk this morning about maritime criticism. I'm going to talk about the challenge of the sea to attempts to politically and juridically fix it, frame it, and enclose it according to the requirements of terrestrial and territorial coordinates. And the argument I want to make this morning is this attempt to fix, frame, and enclose the sea always goes adrift. What I want to talk about is the fruitful and suggestive critical nature of this. As it's happening. The fruitful nature of this drifting which allows us to propose perhaps a different critical space, so as to think about a critical space which is elaborated on floating premises. And I know this is the theme. I've already looked at some of the works upstairs. This is clearly central to the theme of the works in the exhibition upstairs and also in the symposium, today's symposium. So. And the idea here is by thinking about these floating premises, this idea of drift, critical drift, it allows us perhaps to approach a series of questions that are rarely or often have never been posed. A new set of questions. When thinking about modernity, thinking about ethics and aesthetics, thinking about the Mediterranean, thinking about transnational spaces. So here, and most obviously, and this is the theme in the symposium and also particularly in the exhibition upstairs, the status of borders and confines are continually challenged by marine transit, by migration, both legal and illegal, by questions of opacity. I will come back to this idea of opacity later, and by an emerging becoming of a new ideas of citizenship. All this drawn from the differentiated experiences of a migrating modernity. So modernity not only is a space in which we encounter migration and migrations and migrants, both legal and above all illegal, but modernity itself, that becomes a migrating disposition. And at the same time, this migrating modernity implies that this modernity is not merely mine to define, manage, and explain. So this all has enormous ethical and aesthetical consequences. And I thank the Hydrarchy project for providing this space in order to consider and discuss these prospects. So what I'm going to say this morning, I divided into three or four sections. And the first one is called Seascapes. And so commencing from the sea, rather than the habitual location of land and territory, is clearly to propose a slightly unorthodox style of argument. And here we encounter unknown factors, critical uncertainty, and at the same time historical anxieties are provocatively foregrounded. When we can't ground what we're saying, we can't root it in a precise space, a territory, it creates historical anxiety. And I'm interested about how this historical anxiety opens up a new critical horizon. So this choice of perspective, the seascape maritime criticism, has much to do with deliberately seeking to unsettle many of the disciplinary procedures and protocols of the social and human sciences. So opposed to dreams of a systematic order, what I've chosen to call maritime criticism sets existing knowledge afloat. Sets existing knowledge afloat, not to drown or cancel it, but rather to expose it to an unsuspected set of questions and unauthorized interruptions and unauthorized interpretations. So this means that the presumed stability and authority of the historical archive, together with its associated facts and cultural identifications, invariably sealed in the narration of the nation, institutionalized in museums, school textbooks, and university syllabuses, sedimented in the responses of common sense. All this can be set to float, susceptible to drift, unplanned contacts, even shipwreck. Deposited in the sea are histories and cultures held in an indeterminate suspension. These histories and cultures suspended in this aquatic dimension. And these histories and cultures are both held in suspension, and at the same time they're connected rather than simply divided by water. Connected rather than simply divided by water. They suggest other histories, other ways of narrating both a local and a planetary modernity. At the same time, the sea has historically been central to the making of Occidental or Western modernity and the formation of the contemporary nation state. Centrality of the sea to the making of Western modernity. Voyages of so-called discovery, remember 1492, Columbus, etc. European colonization and the global nets of imperialism have all been about the sea. They've all been about the sea, mapping it, crossing it, controlling it. For example, here, the Mediterranean Sea connects Naples to Cairo. This is Naples here, the Vesuvius. Connects Naples to Cairo. It's only 3.5 hours away by plane and not that far by sea. It connects the diverse shores of the Mediterranean in the common theatre of a struggle for global hegemony. This already was an act 200 years ago. So we go here. This is the famous exhibition, the famous military conquest of the ex-Ottoman province of Egypt by Napoleon Bonaparte, 1798 to 1801. But what is interesting here is this in a way is the first chapter in systematic European colonization, not simply the acquiring of territories overseas, but the systematic appropriation of territories. So what we have here is not simply the military appropriation of Egypt by the French. We also have a totalizing appropriation, which involves the application of science, the application of knowledge, also attempting to render Egypt transparent to European eyes. So this is the first example of a systematic appropriation, of systematic European colonization. This begins in the Mediterranean. It also, in many ways, concludes in the Mediterranean between the 1950s and the 1960s. There's a long war of national liberation in Algeria, and of course, Nasser and Egypt freeing themselves of foreign involvement in 1952. So what we have here is this appropriation of territory and accumulation of European capital overseas, not simply the application of military or economic knowledge and organization, but a systematic and scientific appropriation. So we have this famous 26 volumes produced in Paris, in France, between 1810 and 1826, the description of Egypt. We have French scientists measuring the Sphinx, the idea of reducing everything to a transparent modality of knowledge. And of course, as I said, this is a theater of European imperialism. the struggle for global hegemony. So here we have the Battle of Abqua Bay, usually known to the English as the Battle of the Nile, 1798, when the British destroy the French fleet in Egyptian waters on August the 1st, 1798. And at the same time, the year later, we find the same person, Nelson, in the Bay of Naples. So there's these interconnections between the northern and southern shores of the Mediterranean, which are to do with the struggle for global hegemony. The fact that we find the British fleet in Egyptian waters fighting the French, or the British fleet in Naples. It's the same reason we find a British fleet in the Caribbean, a British fleet in the Indian Ocean, and so on in the same period. So, and just to bring us home, Nelson's warship, like all the warships of the British fleet, had its decks painted red. Red in order to hide the blood of the wounded and the dying, of those who were injured during warfare. And his warship, like all the ships of the British fleet, had a motley multinational crew composed of sailors from Britain, India, North America, the West Indies, Malta, Italy, and Africa. And as I said, the decks all painted red to hide the blood of those who fell in battle. This, of course, reflects what might be called what we might like to call a brutal pragmatism. The brutal pragmatism of an imperialism for whom the Mediterranean, like the Caribbean and the Atlantic and Indian Oceans, were parts of a global political economy. A global political economy. This is 200 years ago. So it's long before the contemporary use of globalization. In these spaces, the seaborne empires of Britain and France were struggling for world hegemony. Now, the point I want to make